tonight we actually have this amazing volume of Livy. So it's a history of the Roman Republic that actually belonged to George Mason of Gunstead Hall, father of the Bill of Rights, one of our important founding fathers. And we actually own 2 volumes of this multi-volume set of Livy that he purchased in 1769. And so if those of you who are in the audience haven't seen it, take a look at it. And I have a feeling that those of you watching on the screen are seeing an image of this volume as well. Now, for those of you who either in the room here or online who are interested in getting more involved with the museum's Collection Society, this is a group of it's sort of an add-on group for those of you who are members of our Revolution Society, our George Washington Council. If you're interested in having a little bit more involvement with helping the museum to care for and grow its collection, to have special opportunities to interact with our curators, learn more about the collecting side of our work here at the museum, I think we're going to drop a link in the chat for those of you who are tuning in online. And for those of you here, anyone interested in speaking with a member of staff about our Collection Society, there's some great programming that you can participate in. So before I introduce Dr. Philip Mead, who many of you of course know, who will then introduce Dr. Wood, I just wanted to take a moment to thank again the Haverford Trust Company, who've been incredible partners for the museum since long before we opened. And of course, they've been sponsors of our Read the Revolution series, the in-person version, the digital version, as well as our bi-weekly email series. So for those of you who are just joining us for the first time tonight, or those online, this is maybe the first program, if you go onto the website and sign up for our Read the Revolution email, every 2 weeks you'll receive a short sort of curated selection from a current book about the American Revolution. And it's a great sort of quick 5 to 8 minute read to get you connected and hopefully inspire you to read more deeply about the American Revolution. But I'd love to introduce my good buddy, Tim Gillespie, who's are you going to mount the stage, Tim, I hope? So please come on up. Tim's Vice President and Director of Client Services at Haverford, and most importantly, a great member of our Revolution Society. And I think I don't think you've ever missed one of our evening programs.
Not that I know of.
Yeah, so anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And good evening, everyone. As Scott mentioned, my name is Tim Gillespie, and it is my great pleasure to be here this evening representing the Haverford Trust Company. In that context, I wanted to acknowledge 2 of my Haverford associates who are here with me this evening. Seated here in the first row, we have David Papard, who is a portfolio manager at Haverford and is well known to the team at the museum, given the great work that he has done over the many years on behalf of the museum. Also with us tonight is Elisa Ferralia, who is a senior investment officer at Haverford and also a member of the Young Friends of the Museum Committee. So Elisa, it's been wonderful having you here. The 3 of us are thrilled to be here with our guests this evening, both in person and our virtual guests as well. By way of background, for more than 40 years, the Haverford Trust Company has been a local, privately owned wealth management and personal trust company, serving the needs of our clients, both locally and across the country. We manage more than about $13 billion on behalf of our clients, who are both individuals and institutions. As a local organization based in Radnor, Pennsylvania, we understand the importance of supporting our community. To us, there is no more important relationship than the Museum of the American Revolution. The museum has filled an incredible niche in the city of Philadelphia and in the community, both in terms of historic as well as cultural missions. The exhibits, including the current one that I just toured again this evening, are outstanding, and I encourage you all to take advantage of the opportunity to visit the exhibit while it's here. On a personal note, as Scott mentioned, my wife Susan and I have been involved in this beautiful museum even before this beautiful building existed, and we consider it like a second home. So thanks to Scott and to all of our friends here at the museum for allowing Haverford Trust the honor of once again sponsoring the wonderful Read the Revolution program, and we look forward to the comments of Dr. Wood tonight. Thank you all and enjoy your evening.
You're much more spry than I jumping down from the stage. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you someone known to many of you, of course, Dr. Philip C. Mead, who's our chief historian and curator. Phil's been involved with us since 2011, so he goes back to the Garden of Eden with imagining the visitor experience here at the Museum of the American Revolution. Everything you love about the story that we tell here in the museum comes from the genius that Phil has brought to the museum. So we were really grateful to get him as he was coming out of his graduate training at Harvard. Of course, as an undergraduate, he studied with Professor Wood at Brown University and then went to Harvard to take his PhD. And so these are two very long friends who are getting together tonight for this conversation. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Mead, who will then introduce Dr. Mead. Dr. Wood.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Haverford Trust, for the support of this important program. And I'm very excited to introduce Professor Gordon Wood, one of my longtime mentors, who even when I was in high school was inspiring my thinking about the American Revolution, and so has in many ways had an impact on this place. And in addition to the impact on me, in my scholarship, he was actually directly involved in the development of the museum. He was on the museum's original Board of Scholars in 2003. I actually remember talking to Professor Wood about this project, I think back in 1999, before when it was still part of a project of the Valley Forge Historical Society. He is also an emeritus member of our board of directors. And he is aptly so as one of the most eminent, often described as the dean of studies of the American Revolution in the United States. Some of the background detail on his extensive career, he is the Alva O. Way University professor of history emeritus at Brown University. He's the author of many books, including The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, which won the Bancroft Prize and the John H. Dunning Prize of the American Historical Association. The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History and the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize. The American Revolution, A History. The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin. Revolutionary Characters, What Made the Founders Different, which was a New York Times bestseller. Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815, from Oxford University Press, 2009, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and a winner of the American History Book Prize from the New York Historical Society. And Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Those are just the major books. There's many, many other books and articles. He's a regular reviewer of the New York Review of Books, and as I mentioned, a longtime contributor to the museum. So I hope you'll welcome Professor Wood here to discuss his most recent book, Power and Liberty, Constitutionalism in the American Revolution.
So I wanted to start out with a sort of a big question. You talk in the introduction to this book about the sort of distinctive role of constitutional documents, of sort of founding documents, for the American nation that is not paralleled really for even the other nations, the many nations that have written constitutions at this point. What is the importance of this topic, constitutionalism, to us as Americans, do you think?
Well, we have all these written constitutions. We became the model for the rest of the world, essentially. And now when a new nation is created, and there have been many new nations, say, since World War II, every one of them, well, not everyone, but all but one, Israel, had a written document. That's how they got started. Israel is unique in that sense because it was created after World War II and does not have a written constitution, like the British. It has many, of course, written documents. So the notion of writing down your plan of government, and also it acts as a kind of limit on government at the same time, that was part of the experience of 1776. Mm-hmm. But the founding that you're referring to you all know the founders, and you think of Jefferson, Adams, and Madison, and so on. But for the people in the antebellum period, that is to say, the period prior to the Civil War, the founders were not the men that we isolate, but were the 17th century founders, John Smith, William Bradford, William Penn. Those were the Lord Baltimore. Those were the founders that they talked about. It's not until the eve of the Civil War, and almost, I think, single-handedly, did Lincoln sort of use the founders, Jefferson in particular, to emphasize what he wanted to emphasize, which was the importance of the Declaration in the struggle over what he saw as the elimination of slavery. And so he almost single-handedly recreated or focused on these men that we now focus on: Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, Washington. Those are the leading ones. And he has a number of speeches, which is quite, I think, relevant to us today, because the one in 1858, he was obsessed with the diversity of America. Now, he said all these Swedes, all these Frenchmen, all these Irish, all these Germans, they've all come here from abroad, and yet they have become Americans. And he found this extraordinary. He could scarcely have imagined how diverse we would eventually become. But he felt that this was a problem for Americans, because is this a nation? Because nationhood sort of represented a common heritage, that is a single ethnicity. Can you be a nation with so many diverse peoples? Well, he says we can, and we can because of the Declaration of Independence, and all men are created equal. He said that document, and by implication, I think he meant all the documents that came out of the Revolution, made these founders one with all these people. All these people had become, all these diverse peoples became one with the founders. Then he goes on with an extraordinary image. He says, as if they were flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of the men who wrote that Declaration and the other documents. And that, I think, is why and Lincoln's use of the founders in that way has lasted. That's why we pay this unusual attention to these men back there. It's not that they were geniuses, they were extraordinary generation, but they did somehow solve the problem of uniting a country which is not a natural nation. That is to say, there's no common ethnicity. That's why we've been really able to absorb immigrants in ways that the European nations are still struggling with. Now, we have problems with immigration, as you know, but they pale into insignificance compared to the problems the European nations are facing and will continue to face in the 21st century. So that gave those documents, Lincoln gave those documents a special importance, and it's lingered to our own time.
We actually quote that very Lincoln speech, the electric Chord speech, in Chicago in 1858, where he says, blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh. Right. He says the immigrants are kind of akin to the revolutionaries in their aspiration for the pure, free breath of revolution. We quote that in our final ongoing revolution theater right before a bank of mirrors that invites visitors to say, it says, meet the future of the American Revolution. And what we often mean when we say that, I think, is this principle of that Lincoln was capturing as a sort of essence of it, the egalitarian, we hold these truths to be self-evident statement from the Declaration. But did that mean to Jefferson and to the founders what we think it means?
Well, it's a radical position in the late 18th century. What Jefferson was saying was conventional wisdom. He didn't invent this notion, and he certainly was not. He was not being original in anything he said in the Declaration. But all men being created equal was taken from Locke and Locke's epistemology, that is to say, we are all born with a blank slate. And the obvious differences that emerge, they weren't naive to think everyone's the same as adults, but the differences were due to the forces of the environment. And if you can change the environment, then people can bring their talents to fruition. And that was a defiance of the notion of blood being the most important thing, which is what the aristocrats for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, had believed. They had bred horses, they had bred dogs, and they thought that people could be bred too in a way, and so they put in a lot of it. The old aristocrats in the ancien regime put a tremendous amount of emphasis on blood. Who are your parents? Who are your ancestors? What Jefferson and the other enlightened people were saying in the 18th century when they said all men are created equal, they are defying that old ancien regime convention and saying that we're all start at the same stage and we all can develop differently. We're not born to be what ancestors have determined for us. And so it's a very radical position, but an enlightened position, and certainly many enlightened people, including many aristocrats in England. They didn't like to think that their position was due to their bloodline. They liked to think that they were there because of merit. Of course, that was not always true, and rarely was true. But they liked to think that, so they could actually endorse Jefferson's or the conventional notion, the enlightened notion, that all men are created equal. It was even acceptable to many aristocrats.
You've described this revolution in a lot of your books as a kind of upwelling of a sort of a middle-class revolution, a force that is unleashed by this egalitarian
Right.
idea.
No, it starts as a colonial rebellion, an imperial crisis, which leads to the Declaration of Independence. But in the process of using the notion of equality, they unleash the middle-class people's aspirations, and before they know it, in the northern states, the revolution has become something quite different from what these leaders expected. In fact, I think all of them who lived into the 19th century, and Washington, of course, died on the eve of the 19th century, but 6 months before that, he's filled with pessimism about the future. All of the others who lived, with the exception of Madison, Adams, Jefferson, and Hamilton, they died disillusioned with what they had wrought. The society became much more democratic than they had expected and much more involved in the making of money. They hadn't really expected the kind of, how to put it, bourgeois extremism that was being expressed in the northern states, with all those banks being created, all that paper money flying around, which they scarcely understood. They didn't understand it. Hamilton understood banking. He's probably the only one that did. But he didn't expect all this proliferation of state banks that were issuing scads and scads of money. It was depressing to someone like Jefferson and Adams and the others. So it went way beyond what they had intended. But in fact, I would go so far as it was as transformative of Northern society as the French Revolution was of French society. We didn't have the violence to quite the same extent. We certainly did not have the killing of thousands of participants in the revolution. We had a lot of violence, however, not just the war, but the violence against loyalists, which we scarcely, I think, uncovered in our research.
You mentioned the South as a qualification. You mentioned the North actually as a qualification on that middle-class revolution. How does slavery play? Of course, there's enslaved people in every one of the British mainland colonies and in all of the revolutionary states until they begin
some emancipation efforts. But you describe in this book how there's a focus on slavery that's not incidental to the revolution, that is central to its goals. So
No, slavery, I mean, they were, in one sense, the American Revolution makes slavery a problem. It had existed, as you know, slavery had existed in the world for thousands of years without any substantial criticism. The criticism arises, there are a few Quakers in the middle of the 18th, mostly in this colony, Pennsylvania, criticizing it, but by and large, it's the revolution that suddenly makes it the problem. The first anti-slave society meeting in the history of the world occurs here in this city in 1775. So the revolution and anti-slavery grow up together. And in the northern states, slavery is abolished very quickly. From our standards today, it doesn't seem quick enough because they grandfathered a lot of things in. But by 1804, all of the northern states had legally abolished slavery. This is the first abolition in the history of the world. That is to say, where a slave state, which had slavery, legalized slavery, self-consciously abolished it. And now the northern states did not have the numbers of slaves that Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia had. But they were substantial in some cases. I think 14% of New York was enslaved, 12% of my own state of Rhode Island was enslaved, and it was 3% in Massachusetts. These are small numbers, maybe total of 50,000 slaves when there were hundreds of thousands in the South. But nonetheless, this was an important moment in the history of the world, the first organized anti-slave movement, and has to be appreciated. And for the first time, the South is put on the defensive. Now, they don't abolish slavery, but if they're going to keep it, they're going to have to defend it in ways they never had to do before. And that, I think, is the importance of the revolution in its anti-slavery thrust. Now, they also had, and this is true of many of the Virginians and certainly many others of these founders, that they thought slavery was dying a natural death. Now, they thought maybe 3 or 4 decades it would be gone. They were misled. They couldn't have been more wrong, of course. Slavery was at the beginning of its greatest growth in the South. But there were signs that it was dying. In Washington, for example, Virginia couldn't grow cotton. Tobacco was exhausting the crop, the ground, the soil. And so many of the planters in Virginia, which is by far the largest state, you have to keep that in mind. It's the richest state, the largest state in population, in wealth. As Virginia goes, so does the nation. And no state has ever been as powerful or as prominent in our whole history except Virginia. And Virginians were growing wheat. Washington began planting wheat. Wheat didn't require the labor that tobacco production did, and therefore they had excess slaves, which they were renting out to people in Norfolk and Richmond. And the idea of renting out your slave that's akin to wage labor. And they began to think that maybe this is a transition towards wage labor and that slavery could be abolished. Now, as I say, they couldn't have been more wrong. And Virginia ended up producing, as its major crop, if you will, its major export to the Deep South were slaves. They weren't producing much tobacco. They were producing wheat and grain, but they certainly never produced any cotton. So it was a misleading. They had a sense that maybe slavery's dying, but they were wrong. They lived with that illusion. And we may be living with many illusions too. We don't know about them until some historian tells us about it 200 years later.
And there's many ways in which the revolution hardens slave society.
Oh, yes.
And many of the enslaved people, particularly in the South, found a compelling argument on the British side enough to seek protection of the British Army during the Revolutionary War.
Right. Maybe 20,000, 30,000 slaves fled to the British arms, and many of them ended up in Sierra Leone in Africa, but also they first went up to Canada, and then some of them were moved down to Florida and other places in the British Empire. But that's a small proportion of the hundreds of thousands that existed in the United States.
One of Washington's own enslaved people, Harry Washington, who escaped from Mount Vernon in 1776, ends up in Sierra Leone fighting against the British Empire as a new Washington revolutionary. I wondered, this book you describe as the kind of synthesis or culmination of 50 years of work on the revolution and on constitutionalism, the revolution in particular. I wonder if you could talk about what you discovered in this book that you wanted to say now to your audiences over your career and to new audiences who may have just be encountering your scholarship for the first time. What is about constitutionalism as a device for looking at the revolutionary period that you were seeking to tell us?
Well, it started as a series of lectures that I gave. I was invited to go to Northwestern University's law school, and would you give a half dozen lectures on the American Revolution? So that's what I did in 2019, I guess, in the fall of 2019, before we knew we were going to have a pandemic. And then when I finished, and then we had this lockdown, I decided that this would be a good time to turn them into maybe I could turn them into a book. So it's really a distillation of my whole career. There's not, some things are new. I hadn't worked on anti-slavery so much as and then I have a final chapter on my own state of, it's not a chapter, it's an epilogue, dealing with paper money. Starting with the question, why didn't Rhode Island come to the Constitutional Convention? It's an interesting question. They stayed out of the United States for 2 years. They knew what that convention was going to do. It was going to limit their ability to print paper money. One of the principal evils that James Madison, who is crucial in drawing up the Virginia Plan, which becomes the working model for the convention, one of the evils he saw was states printing, or colonies and then states printing paper money. And the most notorious of those culprits was the state of Rhode Island. And that's why they stayed away from the convention, which Madison and his colleagues said was a good thing, because what could Rhode Island offer to anything? But what I tried to do in that little epilogue is show that paper money was not just to help debtors escape from paying off their creditors, which is what Madison's really concerned about, because you have inflation with a lot of paper money. We know about inflation. You have too much money chasing too few goods, and that was a problem. But it wasn't just that. Paper money is also capital. And Rhode Island had more banks. Well, I first should back up. One thing James Madison, central to his program in the Virginia Plan, was a veto power over all state legislation. That is to say, all state bills would have to come to the Capitol, to the Congress, and get okayed before they became law. Well, the whole thing is so impractical that it staggers me to think that his colleagues didn't throw it out immediately. Well, they didn't. But wiser heads finally prevailed, and they changed that veto or negative over all state legislation to Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which limits the state's ability to do certain things. No, states can't pass tariffs, they can't pass ex post facto laws, and they can't print paper money. Now, if that had been enforced, really enforced, in the decades following the revolution, it would have stifled the economy. It would have frozen it, because there was not enough gold and silver, which of course is the only real money they expected. That would have frozen. What happened was that the states charter banks, which then are free to print the paper money. And no state chartered more banks in proportion to its size than Rhode Island. Every town, every little town, 39 towns had banks, sometimes more than one bank, and they're all printing paper money. That is capital. And as a consequence, by the end of the century, Rhode Island became an economic powerhouse. And by the end of the century, the end of the 19th century, the 5 largest manufacturing firms in the world were located in Rhode Island. Textiles, silver, Gorham silver, small tools, and so on. I mean, I won't go, but the largest in the world. I just wanted to get that point out so that historians would look at this paper money in a different way. We have no good economic history of the whole period leading up to the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War changes everything. Greenbacks come into play. The federal government taxes the state banks out of business, taxes their print money, their printing of paper money out of business, and suddenly we are into the modern world after the Civil War. But it's an interesting story that I wanted to get out there, even if in
I have to ask, as a Brown professor, which is of course in Rhode Island, did you have to wait until you were emeritus to write that chapter about how bad Rhode Island was? I mean, this is a book about constitutionalism, but it isn't a book that's parsing constitutional language and itemizing articles across different state constitutions and comparing them, and it isn't a book of, in a sense, constitutional law scholarship. It's a book that has a lot of social history in it. For those, why is that? What is the, and what is that? How is that captured?
Well,
in the
we argue even today over the courts and the constitutional issues and so on. But beneath all of these arguments, of course, are always social and political developments and pressures and so on. The constitutional issues of the revolution were extraordinary. I mean, first of all, you had the imperial debate, which was conducted in constitutional terms. What can the British government do that's legal? And the Americans felt that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional, that they had no right because we weren't represented in the House of Commons. Well, the British come back and say, well, we have lots of people who aren't represented, that is, they don't vote. And so that argument was important. And of course, the Declaration of Independence is very scrupulous in avoiding mentioning Parliament, which itself is an interesting issue, and I deal with that. But the other thing is the state constitution making of 1776 gets ignored by modern Americans. And yet, that's when the separation of powers and bills of rights and all of the things that we take for granted are first articulated and developed. The federal constitution is impossible without the earlier experience with the state constitutions. It's derived from them. And of course, in 1776, no one in his wildest dreams imagined the federal constitution. Nobody even thinks about that. That's just beyond their ken. They don't even dream it or imagine it. Nobody wants it. What they've got is what they call the Articles of Confederation, which the best way to understand that, it's a treaty, like the Treaty of Lisbon that holds the EU together. If you think of the first confederation of American states, it's like the EU. That's why each of those states is important to. When Jefferson said my country, he meant Virginia. When John Adams says, my country, he meant Massachusetts. And they come together in this treaty. So that's why the states are so important. That's why every state has 2 senators. Now, in our life today, those states don't have that kind of emotional attachment to us. We don't have the same feeling about the state. It seems more of an administrative unit, but we're stuck with this odd situation of each of them having 2 senators. But you have to understand how they began, how they started. Now, something awful, I think, had to happen to convince people that they needed a federal constitution. And that, in Madison's mind, was a series of problems taking place in the states, what he called excesses of democracy. And he said the multiplicity, the mutability, and the injustice of all those state laws that are being passed in the 1780s requires us to find a solution, a remedy for these abuses. Majoritarian factionalism, he called it. Majorities were running wild and hurting minorities. And that's, I think, is the major force behind the creation of the Constitution. And I worked that out in a chapter. The other thing that was developed, of course, was the judiciary. No institution developed more, changed more in the Revolution than did the judiciary. It was a much suspected body in the colonial period, certainly not one of the great capital powers of government, but by the end of the Revolutionary era, by the early 90s, it had come into its own, and you have the beginnings of what came to be called judicial review. And I try to work that out because that's an important part of our constitutional system. There's no judiciary in the world that exercises the kind of authority and power that ours does. And you know about it. It's in the news right now, and people are talking about trying to pack the court or change the nature of the court in some ways. Of course, it's very difficult to change because of the constitutional amendment would be required, and it's not easy to. You could enlarge the court, and so the court could be packed by a simple majority of the Congress. But of course, FDR tried to do that and ran into a buzzsaw, and it failed. So it's probably not going to be politically, but how the court developed in a relatively short period of time is an interesting story. And that's part of the...
All ongoing in many ways, as we say.
Of course. Yeah.
Turn to the audience, and any questions out here?
Throw our first question to the folks watching at home, and then we'll be really excited to open it to the room. We've got some great questions online. I might consolidate them and give a shout out to St. Joseph's Prep students, so hopefully we can get you some extra credit here on this one. Several questions about the role of the West and of Native Americans in the period you study and the Revolution.
The Indians, the Native Americans?
That's right.
Well, you know, the American Revolution, I think, was a success for most people. 50,000 blacks were freed, and certainly ordinary white Americans in the North really became into their own. That's this middle-class revolution. But it was a disaster for the Indians, including for those tribes that helped us. Many of the tribes, of course, were loyal to the British, but several of them were loyal to us, and somehow or other, Americans collapsed all the Indians into people that they had opposed them. The whole story of the clash between the Europeans, immigrants, and the Indians is a tragic one. There's no getting away from it. It's one of the great demographic movements, and the white settlers just overwhelmed the Indians, and we know what happened. It's just a tragic story. There was no way of stopping this movement once they came. It's a demographic disaster from the Indians' point of view. and they were just pushed backwards, further and further west, until the point. And people talk about the longest war was with Afghanistan. Our longest war was with the Indians. It started in the 17th century and wasn't ended until the late 19th century. So it's just one long, disastrous story, and it's a tragedy from the beginning, and there's no getting away from that.
Other question? We have Tyler Putman with the microphone for our audience.
Professor Wood, earlier in your talk, you mentioned about the unprecedented coming together of various ethnic groups who came together so smoothly under the influence of the Constitution. Today, we still have a large number of ethnic groups coming to America, and they very well like to maintain their ethnic identity and celebrate their local cultures. This seems to be a shift in the way people thought about becoming Americans. Do you think that this way that people coming to America maintain their identity in any way threatens the unity that Lincoln was so proud of, or does that enhance the tapestry of our society?
No, I think I'm not an expert in the late 19th century, but if you remember 100 years ago, we had a much more serious crisis with immigration. And I remember John Dos Passos, the novelist, in light of the Sacco Vanzetti trial in 1920-22, he said, he was in despair, and he said, all right then, we are two nations, two separate nations. There's the native born, and then there are all these foreigners coming in, constituting about 13% of the population, which is about the same percentage we have now of foreign born. And they were in despair. We are two nations. But think about it, over the next 60 years or so, or 50 years, those two nations became one. There was intermarriage. Poles married Germans, or Jews married non-Jews, and Irish married Swedes, and that's what happened. And I think the same thing will happen over the next 50 years. People, I think one of the things that's fed some of our politics is this constant statement that by the middle of the 21st century, the majority of people are going to be non-white. Well, that scares the bejesus out of a lot of white people who feel suddenly they're going to be an oppressed minority. Well, it won't happen that way. It'll be the same thing that happened in the first half of the 20th century. There'll be intermarriage. There'll be mingling. Now, maybe you can call it the browning of America, but there won't be this sense that suddenly all the whites will be oppressed by some non-white majority. It's all going to be blurred. That's the way it works. And the more intermarriage we have, the better. Now, there are prices to be paid with intermarriage. You lose some of your ethnic identity, and you end up, well, it ends up with food or something like that. And so there's always been a cost to assimilation. But I think we're an extraordinary nation. We're able to assimilate so many different people. And I think that will continue. So I have confidence in that. I won't be around to see it, but I think some of you younger people will see it'll be troublesome. It's always difficult. The first half of the 20th century was difficult too. But I think the results of that, now we stopped the European immigration by statute, as you know, 1922 and 24, and that made it easier perhaps to assimilate. But I think we'll be able to handle the assimilation that's going to have to go on. We were a little more, how should I put it, authoritarian at the beginning of the 20th century. That's when you have teachers teaching the Mayflower the story, the Plymouth story. That was part of the assimilation process. That's why the Virginians got their nose out of joint, because they said, well, we were here first. 1607, what's this 1620 stuff? But that was a better story for the elementary schools, the Mayflower story, but that was part of assimilation. So our history is, and it shouldn't be distorted, our history, even when it's honestly told, it still can be inspiring, and I think that's what kids should get, and they will become, I hope, proud of the country. We did maintain slavery, but we also assaulted slavery. As I say, the first nation in the world to do so. The Brits didn't get around to it until 1830, and they had all these colonies, Jamaica and Barbados and so on, which had thousands of slaves. They didn't get around to freeing their slaves until a good 50 years after we began freeing them in the North. Now, we did fight a civil war. That's a major story, part of the story. Our history is worth telling. It's an extraordinary saga, I think. I think filled with irony. In fact, most of it is ironic, except when it's tragic. So I think that we can, I don't think we can hold a nation together if we're not proud of our own country. But you have to accept all of the sins and all of the faults, as well as all of the achievements.
Other question?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Wood. Thank you. Fantastic talk. I was wondering if you could...
Can you just pull your mask down so I can hear you clear?
Yes. I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak on where you would like to see the next generation of scholarship go on the American Revolution. I know from your book reviews you can often be quite critical maybe sometimes of how current scholars talk about issues like slavery and race in the founding era. So I was wondering, what are the understudied aspects where you'd like to see?
Right now we're caught up with slavery and race issues and of course with the Indians as well, which is partly race. And women too, and those are understandable issues. But eventually they're going to run out of steam because every dissertation that's being written in graduate schools has to deal with those issues. I would hope they go back to class because that's been ignored. We used to have the race class women issues, but now the class has been neglected. So we go back to class and really document this middle class revolution that I'm talking about. And I think there'll be a greater appreciation of the violence that took place in not just the war, which we know was violent. I mean, 25,000 soldiers died. That's 1% of the population. That's extraordinary. That's larger than any other war we've ever had, except for the Civil War, which both sides were Americans. But it's certainly greater. That would be, today, it would be like 3.5 million people killed in the war. So 1% of the population died. But I'm thinking of the intimidation and the kind of anti-loyalist stuff that went on. We don't know much about that. There's some studies of New Jersey. Hackensack Valley had a lot of militia guerrilla warfare between Whigs and Tories. That all needs to be spelled out. I think that's research, but who knows? You can't, one thing history does not teach you, it does not teach you how to predict. All it does is teach you wisdom, I think, that's it, but not how to predict anything. Yeah?
Professor Wood? I have two questions, if I might. One of them builds into the other. James Madison is referred to as the father of the Constitution. Do you believe that Madison receives too much credit and framers such as Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson don't receive enough, or does each one receive their fair share? And my other one is Professor William Tanner makes the claim that Gouverneur Morris, losing his arguments during the debate of the convention, used his role as the main scribe at the Committee of Style to shape the final document more towards his liking and that of his fellow nationalists.
So is Madison given too much credit, and is Gouverneur Morris overlooked given
well,
that
this
he
is a kind of game that
up?
people play. I mean, obviously, I think Madison was crucial. Let's put it this way. He drew up the Virginia Plan, which was the working model. but he lost his veto, the central thing he wanted, so he was disillusioned with the results. He thought the whole thing was going to fail without it. And he also lost his desire for both houses of the Congress to be proportionally representative. Now, the reason for that, he wanted to keep this. See, he was so fearful of the states because they've been crazy, passing all this crazy legislation. They were under the control of too many middle-class types of people. He has code words for these people: illiberal, narrow-minded, parochial. You'll see those words running through the Federalist Papers. Those are the people who were in the state legislature, and state legislatures that he thought were creating all of these problems. Now, so he didn't want the states to have any say over the Senate. And so he fought really hard against the notion of the states choosing the senators. And he loses that. That's the Connecticut Compromise. That is what we have now, 2 senators from each state. And at that point, the state legislatures elected the senators. He thought that was such a disaster that he caucused with his Virginia colleagues and other nationalists who were frightened of this, bringing the states back into the government. Was going to, there's so much loyalty to the states, he knows about that they'll vitiate the whole system. And so he caucused the next day and said, should we walk out? If Virginia had walked out, that would have been the end of the convention. You can't have a United States without Virginia. So they've decided they're not going to walk out. They stay, and he's in despair. And so when he writes Jefferson when he could do that, see, they took a vow of secrecy, which of course today would never get away with. There's no transparency. He says later, we could never have done this if we had to open it to the press. So he writes a letter, which he had none, couldn't do that because they took vows of secrecy, a letter to Jefferson, and he explains everything, but he says, look, I don't think it's going to work because I've lost my veto and I got the states back into the system. He explains all of his thinking. It goes right by Jefferson. Jefferson doesn't see it all. Only Jefferson can see that there's no Bill of Rights. Jefferson's very much a kind of ideologue. He's a very radical person. But he's been living over in France, and he listens to these Frenchmen, and they tell him, look, you got to have a Bill of Rights. All your state constitutions have Bill of Rights. And so he's very much opposed to the Constitution because it lacks a Bill of Rights. And he writes to Madison and says that, but he also writes to somebody else who publishes his letter, and suddenly Madison has a problem. You know, they did consider a Bill of Rights. At the end of the convention, almost in the last day, George Mason, the man who owned that document you got over there, who had written the Virginia Bill of Rights, and therefore he has a kind of vested interest in Bill of Rights. He says, by the way, we don't have a Bill of Rights for this Constitution. And everybody groans. They've been meeting for 3.5 months through a hot, hot summer, and they all vote it down. Every state votes it down, no Bill of Rights. Madison says, why would you need a Bill of Rights for a government that has limited powers? Because the Congress can only do X, Y, and Z. You know, it can't do everything. Little did they know. And so they don't. But Madison has no confidence in a Bill of Rights. But with Jefferson's letter out there, he's under enormous pressure. So finally, he promises he would if he gets into the Congress, which he finally does. He wanted to go into the Senate, but Patrick Henry, who is an anti-federalist, that is an opponent of the Constitution, ices Madison out. Madison has to run for the House seat, which he does. He beats a young war hero, James Monroe, but he gives a speech. He actually has to campaign, which that was not something he liked, or any of these people like to do. They didn't. That's electioneering. That's sort of what the middle class people were doing. He didn't want to do that, but he did. He won his seat, and first thing he does, he gets into the Congress, he draws up a Bill of Rights, a series of amendments. They get cut, but he's very shrewd. He he picks out those amendments. 200 amendments came in to him from the various ratifying conventions. He picks out those that are the most innocuous ones that just simply, for the most part, except for the 10th Amendment, for the most part, they simply lay out common law liberties. They have no right to search, and there's freedom of speech, and so on. And the anti-federalists, the opponents, are appalled. They want structural amendments, reducing the taxing power. They want to undermine this government. And they regard Madison's Bill of Rights as a tub for the whale. That's an image that was used. Whalers are out, or people in a wooden ship. When they see a whale, that whale could do damage to that ship if it hits it. You throw a tub overboard and it'll distract the whale and he'll go off after the tub, not your ship. So a tub for the whale became a metaphor for a distraction, and that's what Madison's Bill of Rights was. But we got it. First 10 amendments is Madison's creation. Madison is by far the most important. James Wilson is interesting character, underappreciated, largely because he ended up in debtor's prison or escaping from debtor's prison. But Madison is by far the most important figure.
And a Pennsylvania group of rioters attacked his house right across the street
Well,
here
yeah.
in 1779.
Madison, I mean, Wilson
that
is underappreciated. But I have a little anecdote in there that shows you what an arrogant guy. He was a St. Andrews Scottish graduate, and he's probably the first Philadelphia lawyer. You know what a Philadelphia lawyer is? Well, he's the first one. Very smart guy. There's no doubt of it. And he was an ally of Madison's in the thing. But he's a very arrogant guy too.
I'm sorry we don't have more questions, but Dr. Wood will be signing books, so you're welcome to engage with him after the talk. I would like to ask one more from online, which is, how did you get into studying history in the first place? Why aren't we meeting Gordon Wood, the biologist, or the medical doctor? Why history?
Well, it's a long story. I was in the military. I was going to come back from the military. I was ROTC, and go to Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is a FSO, Foreign Service Officer training. But I realized from the arbitrary way in which the military treated me and many other people that I didn't think I wanted to get tied up with the federal government. So I decided to apply, while I was in the Air Force, apply to graduate school. I haven't regretted that decision at all.
Outed as a secret anti-federalist. So, well, thank you so much, Professor Wood.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.